All right, hi all. Welcome to the video lecture for week 13. This week focuses in on hate crimes. So the very first thing I want you to know about a hate crime is that it is a crime plus bias. So it is whatever the underlying crime is plus that biased motive, that biased intent to specifically hurt somebody for belonging to a minority religion, a minority sexual identity, a minority gender identity, a minority race. So for the crime purposes, it's often an assault. And what makes it a hate crime is that additional bias with the intent to specifically hurt a member of that minority group. Now, there are hate crime laws all across the country, and they differ greatly. And in a lot of states, hate crime, if it is established, is used to be a penalty enhancement. It gives the individual who is ultimately convicted a harsher sentence than somebody who engaged in a similar crime without that biased motive. So that's kind of some of the basic background that's really important to understand as you dig through. Now, I am right now in the PDF document that's uploaded here, Implicit Bias and Hate Crimes, a Psychological Framework in Critical Race Theory. I just wanted to walk through a little bit. So this is a book chapter, actually. Actually, it's an empirical article that she's turning into a book chapter, but it explains the psychological process that leads to hate crimes. Primarily that there is prejudice that involves a negative stereotype and a generalized belief about negative traits of a particular group. And these tend to be tied to low status groups like ethnic minorities, gays and lesbians, and things like that. Stigmatized groups. Now, she goes through explaining that people often, that other factors work in tandem with the prejudice to trigger a hate crime, and this is like a situational characteristic, so involving a crowded group, or people who tend to be angry or respond to situations with anger. Is also another factor she identifies is that someone is more likely to commit a hate crime when they perceive a threat to their own group or the groups that represent their own identity. And she also discusses the role of implicit bias in hate crimes. And she specifically notes that the assumption in hate crime legislation is that perpetrators are aware of their negative attitudes and beliefs. And this is true. Sometimes it is absolutely blatant that this person intended to engage in a hate crime. But she also notes that the scholarship here does not always. People sometimes engage in hate crimes because of implicit bias, and they're not always as purposeful as others. So she, again, is kind of working through and explaining this. She explains how implicit prejudice can lead to stereotypes, and how you experience cognitive activation, and increase in accessibility constructs and feelings associated with those groups. So she gives an example of encountering a Black man on the sidewalk, and for some individuals, they may feel danger or afraid. She also notes that sometimes a process called cognitive inhibition occurs where other things may become less accessible due to actions and events. So there's a lot of scholarship that shows that these implicit biases that we don't even process, that just kind of pop up in our brains because we are socialized to think them, can affect how we engage and act. And so that she gives a framework for understanding how these implicit biases can influence hate crime. And she provides just her general framework. So if you scroll to the bottom of that section, you can find a summary of her framework that implicit biases can contribute to hate crimes, but it is hard to circumscribe or explicitly figure out their role. And she notes that the effects of implicit biases may be subtle, but they might tip the scale in causing a specific encounter or event to become violent when it may not have otherwise in another situation. And then she discusses the role of intent in hate crimes, and this section is kind of interesting. We know how important intent and mens rea are in criminal law, and for hate crimes we need that extra intent. Specifically, we need a racial animus, discriminatory victim selection, or causal role of group membership. So in general, you commit the acts because you hate, you have an explicit prejudice towards a particular group, you select your victim because of an identity they hold, or you commit the crime because of a victim's group membership. So that's how these hate crimes are generally defined. But this whole paper kind of explores this idea that implicit bias is related here, and it can tip the scale into violence. So I do highly encourage you to read this. It's very interesting. I think it's very helpful. It can get a little heavy. So if you're working through and you're finding this hard, feel free to email me. Or something that you can also do is kind of skip to the summaries at the end of each section just to get the gist of the idea, because I'm not looking that you have memorized this. What I would really like to see is that that you just kind of understand the relationship between implicit bias and hate crimes just from a psychological standpoint. And again, this is a really interesting one because it really ties in explicit acts as well as implicit acts and how we should handle those in the criminal law. All right, with that being said, we're going to shift at this point to some of the other resources that were posted up on Canvas. The first one, this one is really helpful. Your discussion board this week is going to ask you to define some of these terms in your own words. And so this is right here up from Ohio State, the Implicit Bias Review. And this is a rundown of the basic science, of the basic definitions in the science, where the science is in examining implicit biases. It specifically notes that implicit bias is an attitude or stereotype that affect our understanding, actions, or decisions in an unconscious manner. And it notes some characteristics that everyone has them, that they don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs, and that they're malleable. We can change the way our brains think. There's a few examples. There is one right here about criminal sentencing, which is really interesting. We're focusing on criminal law, and we'll talk a little bit about punishment this semester. So there's that. The next link that you guys have, or excuse me, that you all have, is the Indiana hate crimes information. And there's actually a full manual here that you can look through. It explains a lot. It identifies the known hate groups. Right here, it identifies the Indiana definition of a hate crime, which is an offense. Let me pause and make this bigger. So right here, this part is very helpful, the definition of a hate crime for our state. Hate crimes are an offense in which the person who committed the offense knowingly or intentionally selected the person who was injured, damaged, or otherwise affected the property by the offense because of the color, creed, disability, national origin, race, religion, sexual orientation of the injured person, or the owner or occupant of the affected property is associated with those affiliations. Now, most of these statuses that are specifically identified here are pretty clear. Color is dealing with race and ethnicity, disability, National origin is kind of your heritage, where your family came from before they emigrated here. Race, religion, sexual orientation. Creed is a set of ideas. Sometimes a common example are religious faiths, but there are other creeds that are non-religious as well. The other interesting part here is that the Indiana site goes ahead and defines the federal definition of a hate crime as a criminal offense committed against a person or property which is motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against the victim's race, religion, disability, ethnic origin, national origin, or sexual orientation, even if the offender was mistaken in their perception. So it's very helpful to have those definitions right up front. The next video link here is the FBI landing page, the 2018 hate crime statistics page. You can look at any of them. We'll just start with some general information under the incidences and offenses from 2018. We can see there were 7,000 single bias incidences and over 8,000 crimes, over 8,600 victims, and over 6,000 offenders. Of these, you can see kind of what types of hate crimes are being committed. We see that 57.5% were motivated by race, ethnicity, or ancestry bias. 20% were motivated by a religious bias, 17% by a sexual orientation bias, and then less commonly we have gender identity bias and disability bias and gender bias. By far, so over 77% of hate crimes are prompted by race, ethnicity, ancestry, or religion, which is a substantial number. Of those noted by specifically looking at the race and ethnicity, we see that 46.9% are anti-Black or anti-African American bias, 20% are an anti-white bias, 13% are anti-Hispanic, and then smaller groups. But we do see that every ethnicity that we document is noted here: American Indians, Alaskan, Asian, biracial right here, anti-Arabic bias, anti-Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, as well as other. We'll look at the top three types, so race, ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. Religious bias, we see that 57.8% are anti-Jewish, 14.5% are anti-Islamic, in smaller percentages, but we see many other religious faiths represented here: Sikh, Catholic, and other Christian, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, Hindu, Buddhist, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, atheist, as well as multiple religious groups. So these would just be someone who is hoping to commit a hate crime on the basis of religion without prompting a specific faith. For sexual orientation, we see 59.8% are classified as anti-gay for male, 25.1% are just an anti-LGBTQ in general, 12% are anti-lesbian, 1.5% anti-bisexual, and 1.4% are anti-heterosexual. A quick note about the gender identity. This is more commonly called transgender or gender non-conforming. We generally call everyone in that group, though, transgendered. That's not quite accurate. A more accurate term is gender identity. So we see here that there were 184 offenses as a result of gender identity. Here, though, we do know that there is some underreporting because officers may not know a person's true gender identity. The next link in this week is Project Implicit. There are actually tests available out there to look at your implicit biases or your implicit associations. They do collect the data and publish it. But as you can see, there are tests on a variety of different things. Race, presidents, religion, weapons, weight. So there are a variety of different biases that we can hold, and this kind of lets you get an idea of where you may fall on some of these different biases. And because remember, again, we all have biases. It's more the goal to train yourself to recognize that we do have bias and to adapt to it in the future. The last thing this week is a discussion board, which it asks you to explain the concept in your own words, discuss a little bit about the relationship between hate crimes and bias, and taking a moment to look over the FBI data that we have from 2018, just to discuss some of the things that you found informative. This is a pretty heavy topic this week, but I do think it's important that we have some exposure to this before we graduate. I'm available for any thoughts, any questions, or any concerns you have.